April 26th, 1849, Montreal. Smoke rises from Canada's capital. For 5 years, the city has hosted Canada's legislature and government. But last night, Canada's new and fragile democracy was challenged. The Parliament building was burned to the ground. In the 1840s, after a short-lived rebellion and decades of reformer work, Canada became one of the first democracies in the British Empire, which was no small feat. Ontario and Quebec were fiercely divided on ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines between Canada's French and English parts, and the French language and Quebec Catholicism were oppressed by an English elite. These powerful and wealthy English conservative elites, like the Family Compact and the Chateau clique, held massive sway on politics and the economy. Speaking of politics, it was messy. British imperial overseers had opposed Canadian democratic expression throughout the 1830s and early 40s, supporting local anti-democracy conservatives, using violent racist gangs, buying off MPs, gerrymandering, and more. In spite of this environment, and glossing over a lot of history for simplicity's sake, Canadian reformers more or less beat the odds, creating Canada's first truly democratic, multi-ethnic, and relatively progressive governments, first in 1842 to 1848, and then from 1848 to 1851, led by reform politicians Louis-Hippolyte LaFontaine and Robert Baldwin. It's hard to overstate just how crucial these governments were to setting up modern Canadian democracy. These governments pioneered Canadian responsible government, establishing the democratic principle that a government must maintain the confidence of the elected legislature. They clamped down on electoral violence and intimidation, undid British gerrymandering, increased the independence of the Canadian judiciary, worked to protect the French language and expanded its use in government and civil service, etc. Yet harsh conservative and racist frustration continued to bubble during the reform governments, which continued to make this new Canadian democracy somewhat precarious. This came to a head in 1849 in what's been called the Rebellion Losses Crisis. The reform government had put forth legislation that would compensate citizens in Quebec who suffered damages during the rebellions of 1837. Conservatives jumped on this, be it genuinely or for political opportunity, harshly criticizing it as disloyal, and prejudicially painting the whole bill as rewarding Quebec for traitorous behaviour, despite how conservatives had already given this kind of compensation to citizens in Ontario. These prejudicial accusations kept going, and conservatives sought support from the British government and the Governor-General, hoping that they would crush the compensation legislation in an anti-democratic smash. And to their credit, neither the British nor Governor-General attempted to maim Canadian democracy that year. But this was not the end of the dilemma. Egged on by wealthy conservatives, conservative and racist journalism, and conservative politicians, a riot began in Montreal on the evening of April 25th, 1849. This riot grew more aggressive and dangerous and made its way to the St. Anne's Market Building, Canada's temporary parliament. The rioting crowd threw rocks through the windows and sacked the parliament, and the whole building was put to the torch. By morning, Canada's parliament was a smouldering ruin. Its libraries were ash, and nearly everything within it was gone. The rioting continued through the summer, along with effigy burnings and mobs attacking the homes of Baldwin and LaFontaine. But throughout the crisis, although a few arrests were made, the Canadian government exercised a great deal of restraint and never used its armed forces to fire on crowds or protect the parliament building. And to their credit, and everyone's fortune, 0 deaths are associated with the destruction of the parliament. So the question you might ask is, what changed? Did this attack send Canadian democracy back a decade? Absolutely not. The Canadian government and legislators kept a fairly cool head throughout the crisis, and emerged intact. Though, understandably, the capital promptly moved from Montreal and cycled between Toronto and Quebec City before finally moving on to Ottawa. And although the reform movement remained intact, the same can't really be said for Canadian conservatism. Following the attack on Parliament, Conservatives, unsurprisingly, weren't particularly popular, and were wiped out in the following election. Canadian conservatism went through a period of, shall we say, introspection, and reformed into a big tent political party that accepted Canadian democratic virtues and was more tolerant of French Canadians, that would drive Confederation in the next 20 years. And the reform government continued to change Canada, in spite of the attack on its foundations, going on to build infrastructure along Canada's waterways, establishing Canada's modern jury system and other judicial reform, made the postal system more accessible, increased local democracy in cities, and disenfranchising the few women who could vote? Wait, what? No, why? At the end of the day, a parliament was burned, but Canadian democracy survived. 173 years later, make of that what you will. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more loving videos about Canadian issues. Have a good one.